I sometimes get very emotional when I talk about Ted. It's not because I'm some fan that just is, ooh, Ted Turner. It's that I step back and look at his commitment to so many things in philanthropy.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. There are a small number of people to whom I owe my career, and one of them is Ted Turner. In 1998, he famously pledged $1 billion to support UN causes, which became the United Nations Foundation. The UN Foundation, in turn, was one of my key backers early in my career when I started the first blog about the UN, UN Dispatch. Now there's a new 6-part documentary on Netflix about Ted Turner that I could not more highly recommend. Call Me Ted goes deep into both his personal history and his business ventures, including the founding of CNN. But for me, I think the most intriguing part of the documentary is how deeply it explored Ted Turner's commitment to philanthropy. And as I mentioned throughout my interview with filmmaker Keith Clark, his example sets such a profound contrast to the cast of social media moguls today. So after you listen to this interview with filmmaker Keith Clark, go watch this fascinating 6-part documentary on Netflix. You will learn so much about a man who changed this world for the better. Speaking of philanthropy, I'm looking for new organizations, entities, and individuals that believe in the work of Global Dispatches, the solutions journalism we do, and the kind of underrepresented global stories and voices that we seek to surface. If you have any suggestions for me, maybe you work with such an organization, please get in touch with me. You can email me directly with leads or ideas at markleongoldberg@gmail.com. We could really use the support in 2025. I want this show and Global Dispatches, the newsletter, to survive and thrive in this era. But to do so, we really do need another philanthropic backer. So thank you. Here is my conversation with Keith Clark, writer and director of Call Me Ted, a film that was produced by Joni Levin. Keith, thank you so much for joining me. I so enjoyed your documentary. And let me just kind of put my cards on the table, say off the bat that there are very few people in this world to whom I owe my career, and Ted Turner is one of them.
Ted has touched so many aspects of daily life that I don't think people fully realize. And that was the joy of doing the doc. I thought I knew Ted somewhat. My relationship is actually through my wife and producer, Joni Levin, who started off in the late 80s. She sold Ted a documentary on John Huston, and it was a huge hit on TBS at the time, TNT. And then he gave her a 6-hour documentary on the rise and fall of MGM, and that won Ted his first Emmy. And so it solidified their relationship, professional relationship. We had done some other things for him, In Search of Dr. Seuss, which is great because, Dr. Seuss was himself somewhat of a philanthropist, environmentalist. He believed in teaching children. You couldn't give them a message. You could only slide it in sideways. And Ted loved that idea. I think that's ultimately became maybe the inspiration for Captain Planet.
One of the highlights of my career was interviewing Ted on stage in Rio de Janeiro at a UN conference on the environment and climate called Rio Plus 20. And the topic of our interview was Captain Planet, which, I just turned 44 last week. I am like the Captain Planet generation. I was the target audience. And honestly, I didn't know it was just like Ted Turner just came up with this idea of a children's cartoon to convey the need for international cooperation around climate and the environment. It's kind of brilliant.
Well, it is, when you see in the documentary when Ted makes the announcement, there's such a seriousness and concern on his face. I had to watch hundreds, if not nearly 1,000 hours of archives. And when I watched that, I was just so profoundly moved because you could see the sincerity in his face, the urgency in his face that we need to do this. And then he tells the story that, having been confronted with the issue that environmental concerns were not in the education curriculum, he went away to try and figure out how it should be in the minds of young kids. And he went away that weekend and he thought, how could he do it? And it just popped into his mind. I'll do an animation series. And it's going to be called Captain Planet. And, it's going to be an action series. So kids will be entertained, but at the same time, be educated. And I think that it was the first time that you had a series of characters that represented the world. So you had an Asian, you had an African, a Latino, et cetera, and it became a huge hit. It went into 100 countries around the world.
It's funny when I had him on stage and I was interviewing him about Captain Planet, where the idea came from and how the characters were developed. He said something that was really funny. He said he deliberately made the female characters, the girls, just like a little bit smarter than the boys.
And there's a whole nother side of that because there's a lot of women who joined his company and there were many firsts. There were in different organizations, women rose very quickly into high positions in Ted's world, whether it was the Atlanta Braves or whether there was a variety of companies he had, TNT, TCM, etc. So Ted, which we don't dodge, was not a flawless man, to say the least, when it came to women.
Yeah, I mean, look, his kind of philandering was a recurring theme in the documentary. You don't dodge that at all.
We had total control. Ted had no control whatsoever. And we used his book, his autobiography, Call Me Ted. What's beautiful about the book, which you very rarely read about a man who, let's acknowledge, is very macho. He's very charismatic. He carries himself in that world with his accomplishments. But his book is beautifully vulnerable. And he just shared stories that I know because I have other relationships with, some icons, they would never share. And then when you listen to his audiobook that he actually did himself, you also feel when I decided to do it, I said, okay, I'll do it, but I want to go to the places that he goes in the book. And that became kind of the Bible for the interviews because we interviewed, 19 people, family, friends, associates, Jane Fonda, ex-wife, and etc. And they'd all done some kind of interview about Ted in the past. And it was always kind of, I don't want to say cliche, but they had their rote answers. But I sent them questions that I was going to ask in advance. So if there's anything that offended them or they felt uncomfortable with. So when we sat down, you'd ask the first couple of questions and you could hear instantly they were going to give you the rote answer. And I said, no, this is not this. And I would hold up Ted's book. Whatever Ted says in this book, you're allowed to talk about and go deeper. He's given us permission. We have his full life rights. He gave Joni his full life rights. So once they did that, you, as an interviewer yourself, when somebody changes in front of you, when they
Mm.
suddenly are free somehow. And then, Jane Fonda was a classic example. I sat down with her and I said, well, tell me, it's a linear story. How did you meet Ted? And she just started in a sweet way, just, telling stories she told 1,000 times. And I said, Jane, I love you, but that's not what this is. We need to go deeper. We need to know the ins and outs, the pains, the highs, the lows. And you could see her literally sit back, and it was like she nodded her head and she said, at last.
Yeah, and she went there. All of your interview subjects went there, and it's a long documentary. It's a 6-part series. Much of it focuses on Ted's childhood, the advent of CNN and the Turner Broadcasting Network, the merger with Time Warner, the disastrous merger with AOL, which we can get into. But for the purposes of our conversation, I'd love to have you explain to listeners what drove his approach to philanthropy in general. You look, for example, at this cast of media and social media entrepreneurs today, from Zuckerberg to Elon Musk, and their commitments to philanthropy are nowhere near on the scale of what Ted Turner has done. They might be like way richer, but they are not giving away a proportion of their wealth to the extent that Ted Turner has. And frankly, Ted Turner famously lost like 90% of his wealth, almost like $11 billion or so, when the merger of AOL happened in the year 2000. Yet he continued his commitment to philanthropy despite that. And it's hard for me to imagine the cast of like media tycoons today doing the same.
Yeah, and he continues today. Ted has good days and not so good days, is the way we would put it. So on the good days, he talks to his financial partner, Taylor Glover, on all subjects, business and philanthropy. And those conversations are reasonably good. And the NTI Nuclear Treaty Initiative that Ted
The,
created in 2001, 2002.
yeah, the Nuclear Threat Initiative. But yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
thank you. Nuclear Threat Initiative that Ted and created and had Sam Nunn run it. He still attends those meetings on a Zoom. And
Hmm.
sometimes, he has input and sometimes he doesn't. He just sits there, but he wants to be involved. He still wants to have a voice. And that's when some days, frankly, he can't remember a thing,
Hmm.
but he wants to be involved. He understands the active purpose to have a fuller life. He grasps that. Ted is one of those, as John Malone says, he's a believer. He believes he can change the world. And he continues to do that even with this disease that he has. I sometimes get very emotional when I talk about Ted. It's not because I'm some fan that just is, ooh, Ted Turner. It's that I step back and look at his commitment to so many things in philanthropy.
On that, there are kind of 3 issues that he championed that you mentioned, that you discuss in your documentary, that stand out to me: climate and the environment, nuclear security, and women's health, reproductive health for women and girls, mostly in the developing world. Like, why those 3 issues to him do you think resonated the most deeply?
Ted was haunted by the suicide of his father.
Mhm.
And Ted has these abandonment issues, which he says, I have abandonment issues. He cannot be alone. That's one of the reasons why Jane divorced him. Ted just needs to have constant company because he is afraid to be alone. Because if he's alone, then, the demons of his past, which are really all from his child and his relationship with his father and his father killing himself, haunt him. It's just a fact. He's very candid about it. And what I admire about that is that he has that burden, but he is able to continue and has succeeded in so many areas. On the environment, Ted found great solace in being in the open, in the forests, in the woods, with Jimmy Brown, who was this African American who worked for his father, who at the age of 9 Ted met, and basically Jimmy Brown became his friend, father, mentor. And Jimmy Brown went on to become, he took care of Ted's kids in a real profound way. So Jimmy and Ted would spend all the time when Ted wasn't at school in the woods hunting and just appreciating nature. And then Ted always loved animals. He did taxidermy when he was 9. He had many pets. So he grew up with this passion for needing to be in nature. So he put his money where his mouth is.
And he did that as well by founding the United Nations Foundation. Can you just tell that story to the audience? It's one I know sort of intimately and very well. What happened? How did he end up committing $1 billion to UN causes?
So Ted has always loved the United Nations. Some people, say CNN changed the world, but I believe that CNN changed Ted. Ted had traveled the world because he was a great sailor. He won the America's Cup and he was constantly traveling the world. And that opened up the world to Ted. He was this Southern boy and had this view of America as, the only superpower. Everything was perfect about America. But then he went and started traveling around the world and he started seeing how other lives and other cultures were. And then when he did the Goodwill Games, which was, in a sense, I know it's going to sound strange, was a philanthropic situation because when he did the Goodwill Games, he knew going in that he was going to lose millions and millions of dollars. And when he did the Moscow Games, he did it because he realized that the Soviet Union and United States Cold War could potentially destroy each other. And they weren't talking. They simply weren't talking. And Ted's philosophy is you have to keep talking because once you stop talking, the bullets start flying. And so he created the Goodwill Games, which was basically an Olympic style game and had, 3,000 best competitors around the world. But ostensibly, it was to have Russian and American competing against each other. When you look at the Goodwill Games and the quality of it, it competed with everything that the Olympic Games did, but it created a relationship with him and Gorbachev. And he went to Gorbachev. Now, this is just Ted Turner. Who's Ted Turner going to President Gorbachev and saying, hey, listen, you're the only one that can talk about nuclear disarmament. You have to do it first.
Yeah, because the political circumstances in the United States were not one that aligned towards like nuclear disarmament talks, like the Reagan Bush administrations just like weren't there.
Yeah, and it was also the fact that it might have made Reagan seem weak going to the Russians. And he said, Mr. Gorbachev, or Gorby as he called him, you have to make the first step. And he did. And that's what the nuclear disarmament meetings were all about. And so a lot of people give Ted credit for that, opening up the opportunity for Gorbachev to introduce perestroika, because as in the documentary, several of the people who went, friends of Ted, had this vision of this horror, this monster that was Soviet Union, and the people were awful. But as soon as they got there, they realized, oh my God, they're like us. They love their children. They want to put food on the table, but they're under the gun of a certain ideology. And if they could just get away from it, we could relate to each other more. And so American and world views got a different view of Russia because of that. It wasn't propaganda. And so from that, that's where Ted, really got involved.
It sounds like that experience of putting on the Goodwill Games is what kind of led Ted Turner to more deeply understand like the need for international cooperation. And he was already kind of positively disposed towards the UN, presumably for its like work on the environment and just the ideals that it stands for, very much aligned with his own kind of worldview and ideals. And then you have in the late 1990s, Republicans in Congress blocking American funding for the United Nations. The United States was like $1 billion in arrears in debt to the UN. And as the story goes, Ted Turner was riding high at the moment. He's like, I have $1 billion. I'll give it to the UN. It turns out you can't quite do that. So he set up the UN Foundation in order to support UN causes. And it was like a shocking announcement.
Well, it was, in only the way that Ted Turner, his swashbuckling way, is that he just merged his TNT, his Turner Broadcasting System, with Warner Brothers. And within 9 months, his wealth grew by $1 billion. He was being honored by the UN because, again, going back to the Goodwill Games and things like that, he realized how important the UN was and is that it's a platform where people talk. And, there's a lot of problems with it. It doesn't always work out, but it brings all the nations together. And he always loved that because he saw it as a way to not only prevent wars, but to give aid and to give understanding to other cultures. So it was literally, while he's been honored as the Man of the Year for no other reason than, his conservation. And so he wanted to honor them somehow. And as you said, they were in arrears by $1 billion by the Americans had not given them the funding that they had promised. More, I believe, as punishment because of what they weren't getting the way. So Ted literally is thinking about what he can do, and he makes an announcement on the night that he gets this award. And it was shocking. We have footage in the documentary where he and Kofi Annan are meeting earlier in the day, and Ted knows what he's going to do, but he hasn't told Kofi. So it's like they're in this little chat. Yeah, we'll do this tonight, and we'll honor you, Ted, etc. And then when Ted gets there, Ted says, "I've decided I'm going to donate $1 billion, but apparently I can't just donate. I have to set up a fund." And so we're working that out, and that's when the UNF, United Nations Foundation, was created. And it has accomplished so many things and continues to today. And his $1 billion has grown to nearly $1.2 billion, maybe $1.3 billion. So he's very much involved in that today. But when Time Warner, Ted Turner, merged with AOL.
Well, so yeah, this is where I wanted to go because this is like what is most interesting to me and what I think distinguishes Ted Turner from the current class of media tycoons and social media tycoons. So you'll have to just tell the story of how Ted Turner lost so much of his wealth, yet continued to maintain that commitment to philanthropy at the same level as he committed before. Like he didn't reduce his philanthropic contributions, even though he lost something like 90% of his wealth on paper.
So Time Warner was approached by Steve Case, who was the chairman of AOL. It was late 90s when the internet was bursting. All these companies, if you just said something.com, people would invest because they just thought it was taking off. And so it is still the biggest merger in history. It was a $160 billion merger between AOL and Time Warner. Ted's stock rose to about $10 billion from about $2 billion, which is still a lot of money, $10 billion. But within 4 months, the internet collapsed. The bubble just burst. And so Ted loses $8 billion literally within a year. I mean, that's 80% of anybody's fortune. But Ted in his way says, yeah, but I can still get by on $2 billion. But the reality is a lot of his money, which a lot of people don't know, and we didn't talk about in the documentary, is a lot of his money was in land. So it wasn't cash in the bank. He obviously had other stock holdings and other businesses, but a lot of it was in land. So it wasn't like he had ready cash. The way that he'd set up the UN Foundation was he was going to write a check every year for $100 million over 10 years. And now he's just lost his fortune. And the first thing that he does is he goes to Taylor Glover, his financial partner, and says, okay, I'm going to honor this. How do we do it? And they went in, and out of that, basically their $2 billion left, his commitment wasn't still $800 million. And so he basically said, we're going to write a check every 3 months for $25 million for the next 8 years. And that's what he did. It was a side issue that could not be interfered with any of his other commitments. And so he was committing a huge, literally half of his wealth at that time to continue his commitment to the UN and the UN Foundation. And as you say, I just don't know, other than Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, I don't know who makes that kind of commitment. And he
Yeah.
continues to make that commitment today. And then all of the work that the UN Foundation has done in natural disasters and man-made disasters, medication, education, as you say, women's rights around the world. I think Jane Fonda had something to do with that, in the sense that Ted was always, he has daughters, and always had a business respect for women, in particular, intellectual respect for women. But I think it was Jane who brought women's rights on a profound way.
Yeah, the last time I think I saw Ted Turner was at one of his 80th birthday celebrations that Jane Fonda emceed. It was a gathering for the United Nations Foundation in New York, and he wore the same tie he always wears every time I've seen him, the little kids holding hands like a UNICEF tie. And Jane Fonda emceed, and his diagnosis of that dementia had been made public, a few months or a few years prior, but he gave a speech and was well received, and Kofi Annan was alive at the time, and shook hands with him. And I remember just kind of taking a picture of him and Kofi Annan, and it's kind of the same event that the pledge of the $1 billion was made 2 decades earlier. And it was just, it's impressive to see the lasting impact that he has had. And again, I say this as someone who's been a beneficiary of his philanthropy, so I'm not dispassionate on this front. I will say that he has made a lasting difference in this world in so many different ways.
Yeah, and I think that's when I step back and I separate myself from the documentary and I just look at Ted's commitment to really, it seems so simplistic, cliche, he wants to save the world. But in Ted's mind and his actions over the last 40 years, 45 years, that's what he's doing today. He's honoring all the Jacques Cousteaus that came before him. They saw what the environmental disaster was that is on the horizon. And that's, one of the things that we set out to do, by the way, is that we wanted to introduce Ted Turner to this generation, to say that there are people who have been fighting this battle for a long time, who are fighting the battle for a better world, better environment, conservation, etc., for a long time. And this is one man who put his money where his mouth is. He should be recognized for what he's done, not just like with an award, but a constant reminder. Because when you listen to some of his conferences and speeches, this is a man who has so much passion and willingness to step out, against the norms of the day. This generation are a little at a loss at that kind of wealth and how it's not being utilized better, other than to collect more yachts and houses and stuff.
If only this kind of generation of media tycoons, the Bezoses, the Musks, the Zuckerbergs, that lot had that same kind of commitment to philanthropy, to global cooperation, to the environment. I just can only imagine what a different kind of place this world would be if others followed Ted Turner's lead.
You just wonder what their upbringing was, that they don't connect with humanity in the way that they could or should. It's like they build businesses in such a focused way that humanity is almost widgets to accomplish their wealth, then that they have their own toys, in the sense that they're important toys in some level, which is, space exploration, EVs, electric vehicles from Musk, etc. It helps. But it's that there's a disconnect somewhere. I have no idea what Zuckerberg, he seems to have been an insecure young man and seems incredibly insecure to this day. Irrelevant of his success, his wealth, and his desires, he just doesn't seem to be able to connect with the rest of humanity. I don't want to, in a sense, I don't want to judge him because I don't know him, but it's everything that he does. When these guys donate to philanthropic causes, it does feel like it's either a tax write-off or a publicity, some PR thing. Bezos' ex-wife obviously is doing great things in philanthropy, but that's not necessarily Bezos. And again, you're right. Look, it would be great if Ted was as cognizant as he'd been in the past. Could you imagine him sitting down with these guys?
If only. Well, Keith, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time and for the amazing documentary.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.